If I asked you to name the most important strip of land in human history, you might say the Holy Land, or Rome, or Greece. But there's a case to be made for a crescent-shaped arc of territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Nile Delta, a region most people couldn't point to on a map. And here's the thing. Almost everything in the Old Testament happens along this crescent. Not near it, along it. Welcome back to OT in Context. I'm Scott Smith, and last episode we talked about why geography matters, how the Bible isn't set in Middle Earth, but in real places with real terrain that shaped real history. Today we zoom out and look at the single most important geographic feature for understanding the Old Testament, the Fertile Crescent. This is the big picture. Once you have this mental image, a huge amount of biblical history, why empires rose where they did, why Abraham traveled the route that he did, why Israel was constantly caught between great powers, starts to make sense. Let's build a picture. If you're looking at a map of the ancient Near East, here's what you see. Much of the surrounding region is arid, rugged, or poorly suited to dense agricultural settlement. To the south and west, the Arabian Desert and the Sinai Peninsula. To the east, the Iranian Plateau. Enormous stretches of lands where large-scale farming was difficult to sustain, and therefore where the major urban civilizations of the Old Testament world did not take hold. But cutting through all of that is a curve of fertile, livable territory. It begins here at the head of the Persian Gulf. It follows the Tigris and Euphrates rivers northward and westward through what is today Iraq and Syria. Then it bends south along the eastern Mediterranean coast, through modern Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, and at its western end connects to the Nile Delta in Egypt. From above, the shape is unmistakably a crescent. The term Fertile Crescent was coined by archaeologist James Henry Breasted in 1916, but the geographic reality he was describing is ancient. This was the land where water was available, where soil was arable, and where you could sustain a population large enough to build cities. And here's the key principle. Civilization follows water. Not always, not exclusively, but as a rule of thumb for the ancient world, it holds. Where rivers flowed, people settled. Where people settled, cities grew. Where cities grew, writing developed, armies formed, and empires rose. And the Fertile Crescent is one of those earliest places in the world where all of that came together at a large scale. Let's think about why for a moment, because it matters for reading Scripture. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers do something remarkable. They flood seasonally and leave behind mineral-rich silt across the flatlands between them. These river systems made large-scale irrigation agriculture possible. Not easy, but possible. You could channel, manage, and direct the water in ways that rain-dependent farming simply couldn't match. This is why complex civilization emerged here in Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, earlier than almost anywhere else. By the late 4th millennium BC, the people of southern Mesopotamia had developed the earliest known writing, organized legal structures, urban planning, and long-distance trade, not because they were smarter than everyone else, but because they lived where geography made complex society possible. The same story plays out at the other end of the crescent. The Nile's annual inundation was generally far more dependable than rainfall agriculture in Canaan, depositing fertile black soil along the riverbanks with a regularity that made long-term planning possible. The rest of Egypt is desert, but along the Nile, life was possible. And so Egypt became the second great anchor of ancient Near Eastern civilization. Two great river systems, one at each end of the crescent, and everything in between, the trade routes, the migrations, the military campaigns, the political alliances, all flowing along the arc that connected them. Now watch what happens when you add Israel to this picture. Israel sits on the Levantine corridor linking Egypt with Syria and Mesopotamia. The land bridge between them, right at the hinge. That placement was not accidental, and it explains almost everything about Israel's story. Here's a quick tour of the major players, because knowing who they were and where they lived is essential for navigating the Old Testament. This is Sumer, at the southeastern end of Mesopotamia, near the Persian Gulf. This is where the earliest known writing emerged, around 3200 BC. This is where Ur was located, the city Abraham came from. Akkad, just north of Sumer. Under Sargon of Akkad, often regarded as the first great territorial empire in history. It collapsed within a few centuries, but Akkadian became the major diplomatic language of much of the ancient Near East for centuries afterward. Babylon in central Mesopotamia, home of Hammurabi and his famous law code. Later, under Nebuchadnezzar, the power that destroyed Jerusalem and took Judah into exile in 586 BC. Assyria in northern Mesopotamia, centered on the cities of Nineveh and Ashur, the empire that conquered the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC. The terror the prophets kept warning about. By the time we reached the middle of the second millennium BC, a third major power had emerged to the north, the Hittites, centered in what is today Turkey. Not strictly on the crescent, but a force whose rivalry with Egypt and presence in Syria put constant pressure on the world around Canaan. If you've read about Uriah the Hittite in the David narrative, or the Hittites listed among Canaan's pre-Israelite peoples, this is who they were. Egypt, the great constant, present from the very beginning of the biblical story. Abraham goes there during famine. Joseph rises to power there. Israel is enslaved there. The Exodus begins there. And through all of this, through centuries of rising and falling empires, the land we know as Canaan, and later Israel, sits in the middle. For major land campaigns between Egypt and the powers to the northeast, the Levantine corridor was the usual route. It ran along the coast, the Via Maris, and along its eastern edge, the King's Highway. There was no comparably easy overland alternative for large armies. This is why the prophets talk about foreign nations the way they do. This is why the king's narrative is filled with alliances, tribute, and invasion. Israel wasn't randomly caught in other people's conflicts. They were positioned at the corridor every major power had to contend with. Let me give you a few concrete examples of how this geographic reality shows up in the biblical text. Why did Abraham travel northwest to Haran before turning southwest into Canaan? The text doesn't explain this. It doesn't need to. The most practical long-distance route in the ancient world followed settled corridors, places with water, pasture, and established communities, rather than cutting straight across deep desert. Abraham's journey was a real migration through the ancient Near East, carried out along the routes that connected it. And it was also an act of faith in the God who called him. Both things are true at the same time. Why does everyone go to Egypt during famine? Because Egypt's agriculture depended on the Nile, not on rainfall. When drought hit the Levant, Egypt often remained comparatively secure. It was a grain-rich refuge in a region where rain failure could be catastrophic. When Abraham goes to Egypt in Genesis 12, and when Jacob sends his sons in Genesis 42, this isn't incidental detail. It's the geographic logic of the ancient world operating exactly as it always did. Though it's worth noting, Egypt feeds, but it also enslaves. It's never merely a practical solution in the biblical story. There's always more going on. When Nebuchadnezzar exiled Judah to Babylon in 586 BC, where did they go? Northeast along the Fertile Crescent, a journey of roughly 1,000 miles following the arc of livable territory. But consider what that route actually was. It was Abraham's route, walked in reverse. God had called Abraham out of Mesopotamia, northwest along the crescent toward the Promised Land. That journey was the beginning of the covenant, the movement of election, promise, and blessing. Now, centuries later, the covenant people were making the exact same journey backward, northeast, back toward Mesopotamia, back toward the land their father had left. The geography explains the route. The theology explains what it meant. This wasn't just a military deportation. It was covenant judgment, the loss of the land that had been the sign of blessing, and the prophets had been warning about it for generations. When Ezra and Nehemiah later lead the return, they come back the same way. The crescent is the highway. The whole story runs on it. In the next episode, we're going to zoom in on the northeastern end of the crescent, Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. We'll look at Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, and why that region matters so much for the first half of the Old Testament. If this kind of context is helpful to you, the best thing you can do is subscribe and share it with someone in your church, small group, or Bible study. This is exactly the kind of material that unlocks the Bible for people who've been reading it for years but feel like they're missing something. And if you want to explore the Fertile Crescent for yourself, see the geography, trace Abraham's route, watch how the empire has shifted over centuries, all of that is waiting for you at otincontext.com. I'll see you in the next one.